Now on Kursk and Russia and fears of nuclear escalation, whatever that means, we decided to talk to United States Air Force veteran who served as a nuclear and missile operations officer. Interview on UATV. Our guest tonight is Jake Broe, United States Air Force veteran who served as a nuclear and missile operations officer. Hello, Mr. Broe.
Hello, thanks for having me, Henry.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure. And I'm just craving to know, well, Ukraine needs oil refineries in Russia. I've enjoyed the videos a lot, but in terms of efficiency, is that an efficient act of war for Ukrainian army? What do you say?
It was with the Allies during World War II. So going after a nation's strategic oil reserves, militaries run on oil. So I think this was a strategy that Ukraine devised last winter. They started aggressively striking oil depots and oil refineries in January, and we're not going to see the full results. We're not going to see the full benefits, I think, until this winter. So it's fascinating to see. The Kremlin is not releasing the data of how their oil industry is operating at the moment, but we're going to see the benefits or the results pretty darn soon.
Of course, the Kremlin is not releasing anything, but like Belarusian troops like crowding near the border with Ukraine. Do you know why?
I'm sure Putin got on the phone and yelled at Lukashenko and told him, move all your guys to the border. Lukashenko does not want to attack Ukraine. If he actually wanted to participate in this war, he would have done so 2.5 years ago. To any Belarusian citizen that wants to participate in Putin's special military operation to destroy Ukraine, they've had 2.5 years to sign a contract. I'm sure the Russian military would love to have them. So I'm convinced Lukashenko doesn't really actually want anything to do with this war anymore. When Putin sold it to him, it was supposed to be a 3-day special military operation. 2.5 years later, Lukashenko is just trying to stay alive. He doesn't want to be murdered by his own people like Gaddafi was. So no, I don't think Lukashenko is going to commit his military to attacking Ukraine. But as far as moving guys to the border, yeah, that costs him next to nothing, and he's happy to do Putin a favor just in that.
Kind of showing off, just and trying to stay alive. That makes sense. Thank you so very much. I'll take that as an answer. But events in the Kursk region of Ukraine, Russia. Can you please comment on the strategic importance of such events in regards to Ukraine's partners? So do you think of that Kursk operation? What do you think? Are you encouraged?
Yes, there's several aspects here. We can just take at face value what Zelensky says the objective was: to create a buffer zone on the Russian side of the border to protect Ukrainian villages. If they can create a 20 to 30 kilometer buffer inside of Russia, Russia can no longer use artillery to strike Ukrainian towns. So if that was the only benefit, that's still a pretty good benefit. But there are numerous others. The first one that I think Zelensky is very concerned with is the politics. Ukraine has to show some tangible benefit in order for their supporters and allies around the world to lobby their governments for additional military aid. When you can show results on the battlefield, you can then make arguments in parliament or in Congress or in the capitals. Let's keep giving Ukraine military aid. They will get results. When we give Ukraine the weapons they need, they can defeat the Russians. The third aspect is just dispelling the myth about the nuclear threat. What are Russia's red lines? And at the moment, there are the armed forces of Ukraine occupying the sovereign territory of Russia, the internationally recognized territory of Russia.
Right.
And nobody is talking about nuclear weapons anymore. For 2.5 years, it's been scare tactics. If you provide Leopards, if you provide Patriots, if you provide F-16s,
right,
we're going to nuke you. And there are no red lines. I've made this argument consistently the last 2 years on my channel that there's no benefit for Russia to use a nuclear weapon anywhere in the world. The blowback and negative consequences would exceed any tangible benefits on the battlefield. So Russia is not going to use a nuclear weapon. There are no red lines. All restrictions should be lifted. and Ukraine should be allowed to win this war.
What a lovely answer. Well, let me first quote NBC News for you. Faced with ignominy of losing his own territory to the neighbor he had invaded, the assumption seemed Putin would scramble the Kremlin's might to drive out the Ukrainians, even if it meant sacrificing progress elsewhere. End of quote. That has not been the case, obviously. Why, do you think?
It is fascinating watching these clips on Kremlin state TV. They're already changing the narrative that Ukrainians sometimes occupying Russian territory is the new normal.
Right.
As part of Putin's special military operation, sometimes Russia just loses their own sovereign territory. The new narrative is it's not a big deal. Nothing to worry about. Russia is massive. Russia is big. People in Russia won't even notice that part of Kursk is now gone. That's insane to me, but that's the reality that a dictator can spin. When a dictator controls the narrative, when he controls all media, reality is just whatever he wants it to be. So Putin knows that these Ukrainian forces in Kursk are not going to be expelled anytime soon. I think Ukraine's going to hold on to this territory until the war is finally over and there's some kind of negotiation to give it back. But Putin doesn't care. He's concerned about other fronts. His military at the moment is focused on Donetsk. They're focusing on Pokrovsk. I think that Russia is trying to take as much territory as they can inside of Ukraine prior to this ceasefire that they're seeking. They believe that perhaps after the November election here in the United States, they can sit at the negotiating table and get even more territory from concessions. Putin's done very well negotiating with weak Western leaders the last 24 years. So the guy in some ways is an optimist that he can trick and fool and bully the Western partners into just giving him what he wants. I don't think that's going to happen anymore. I think he's gone too far. I think the West is not going to tolerate this anymore. But he's going to keep pretending like everything's okay because he views that as his best path forward.
Right. Well, you say West is not going to tolerate that anymore, but you know what? I hate this term, escalation, well, there's talks of escalation. There's professional political cowards using these terms or abusing this term, just to not want to face the fact. It seems to me that every escalation in every war in human history was stopped by force, with arms in your hand, not paperwork or not calls to negotiation, because dictators do not negotiate, is that right? They just take lands and ex-lands, or they are defeated. So if the West is not afraid and is not going to tolerate anything, then why Putin is not defeated yet? Where are the weapons? I mean, enough weapons and fast enough weapons coming, of course, but like snail slow. Why is that, you think?
We say the West, but we can be honest, the West is not unified. If you're one of Russia's neighbors, the Baltics, Poland, Finland, you have a different opinion than maybe people in Berlin or Paris or Washington, D.C. I'm convinced that the ultimate goal of my government, the United States, is to prevent nuclear war at all costs. We don't want to see Russia dissolve, Russia break up, and then have regional warlords fighting over oil and gas fields and gold mines with nuclear weapons. So in some ways, I do think at the highest levels of power in our governments, they're trying to protect Putin. They're trying to keep Putin alive and in charge of Russia to prevent Russia from collapsing, because in that nightmare scenario, many people would die. If Russia as a state fell apart and then broke up into civil war and nuclear weapons are being possessed and used by all these regional powers. But my argument is we can't prevent that. We can't say to Putin, all right, we'll give you whatever you want, like we've been doing the last 2 decades. But please don't leave office. Please don't allow Russia to collapse. There's a broader historical narrative here in that when the old colonial powers broke up and decolonized, Russia skated by. Russia's hold on the Caucasus and Central Asia and Siberia that shouldn't be Russian territory. It should have been decolonized. The Russian Empire during the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s took all this territory by force, subjugated all these people, and they were never given their freedom. They were never given their autonomy back. We don't have good answers here. Nobody knows what's going to happen 6 months from now, but we're going to find out together. And my argument is Putin didn't give us a choice. We're not just going to give Putin whatever he wants to prevent bad things from happening.
Absolutely.
Because bad things are happening right now to Ukraine.
No, absolutely. I agree with that. But, my argument in terms of if we don't want to see Russia falling apart because there's going to be a big war and a lot of people are going to die, I can't agree to that because USSR fell apart at some point and there was no nuclear war and not much people died, actually. There was not a war right now going on in battlefields and in the skies with Ukraine or with any other country, but still USSR was way bigger and way more looking like an empire than Russia is. Russia is trying to look like, but not. But anyway, we don't want a big war in Europe, but I think that there's going to be a big war in Europe if we are not going to stay together and stop Putin. Do you think that we maybe have to have more weapons and faster weapons? How do you think we can convince West to deliver more, like air defense for Ukraine? Because you have to see what's going on right now. Hundreds of missiles and drones recently onto Ukraine, and Putin is just taking his oil bath and waving his nuclear gavel. Is West afraid, Mr. Broe, do you think?
Ordinary citizens living in the West have to continue pressure on their government. And unfortunately, we've seen what pressure on our governments can do. When Western capitals were saying no to Leopard tanks, when they were saying no to F-16s, when they were saying no to the use of ATACMS, people kept the pressure on their governments to say, change that position. That's not a real red line. So as far as more military aid, I'm an American. I can only speak for the United States, but we're going to have another political debate this November, December, or January about an additional year's worth of funding, another $60 billion. And ordinary Americans who support Ukraine, you got to call and write your representatives. You got to apply pressure.
True.
That's just the democratic process, how anything gets done. Concerning the bigger picture, to the first part of your question, we need to have a new way of thinking about trade and relations with authoritarian regimes. The fact that countries like Iran, North Korea, Syria, Russia are all militarily cooperating. If you want to lump in the Chinese are not looking very friendly towards their neighbor Taiwan. But this is a new discussion we have to have. The belief that if we just have good trade relations and good diplomatic relations with authoritarian regimes, then we can live in peace with them. And that's not what's happened. Okay. Putin has dispelled that myth. If we do business with dictators, if we make them rich, if we give them our technology and we buy their oil at inflated prices, what are they going to do with that money? We assumed that making these authoritarian regimes wealthy would liberalize them. A middle class would bloom and a Russian middle class would demand human rights and representative democracy. It's not happening.
No.
China, Russia, they just take our money, they corrupt us, they make our democracies weaker, and then they just build up their military force. They're never going to stop. More people will die if we continue business as normal with these authoritarian regimes.
All I can say is thank you so very much for this lovely interview and for your time and for your obvious expertise. I hope to talk to you very soon, and I have a whole bunch of questions for you, and I just don't have enough time for the moment. But thank you so very much.
Thank you, Henry.
Thank you. Goodbye. It was Jake Broe answering all the questions, and brilliantly answering, if you ask me, United States Air Force veteran who served as a nuclear and missile operations officer. Thank you, and stay tuned for UATV English.